Our story begins in a small, quiet town where everyone knows everyone, and secrets rarely stay hidden. The Johnsons were the family that everyone admired. There was Richard, the stepfather, a man of charisma and charm who worked as a respected lawyer. He was the kind of man people trusted without question, the kind who would go out of his way to help a neighbor or coach the local kids' soccer team. His wife Evelyn was the picture of grace, always smiling, always kind. And then there was Lily, Evelyn's daughter from her first marriage, bright, inquisitive 16-year-old with a knack for solving puzzles. To the outside world, they were the perfect family, living in a beautiful suburban home with a white picket fence and a dog named Max. But behind closed doors, the reality was much darker. Richard had a secret. It was a secret that, if revealed, would destroy the perfect life he had built. He was having an affair with a younger woman, someone he had met during a business trip a year ago. At first, it was exciting, a thrilling escape from the mundane routine of suburban life. But as time went on, the affair became a burden, a source of constant fear and paranoia. Lily, always observant, started to notice small things. Richard's frequent late-night phone calls, the way he would suddenly become defensive when asked about his day, and the strange, almost desperate look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. She began to piece together the puzzle, but she didn't like where it was leading. One night, after overhearing a heated argument between Richard and his lover on the phone, Lily's suspicions solidified. She confronted him, her voice trembling but determined. "I know you were cheating on Mom," she said, her eyes boring into his. Richard denied it, of course. He laughed it off, called her silly, and even tried to turn the tables, accusing her of being too nosy. But Lily wasn't convinced. She knew what she had heard, what she had seen. She just needed proof. As the weeks passed, Lily became a detective in her own home. She snooped through Richard's things, eavesdropped on his conversations, and kept a diary of everything she found. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop herself. The truth needed to come out. But Richard was no fool. He could feel the walls closing in, could sense Lily's eyes on him wherever he went. The thought of his secret being exposed terrified him, and that fear quickly turned into something darker. The affair had started innocently enough, or so Richard told himself. It was just a fling, a distraction from the pressures of life. But as his relationship with his lover, Emily, deepened, it became more than that. It became an obsession. Emily was everything Evelyn wasn't: young, adventurous, and most importantly, unattached. She didn't ask questions about his family life or demand more than he was willing to give. But as time went on, she started to want more. More time, more attention, and more promises that one day they could be together without the shadows of deceit hanging over them. Richard knew he was in too deep. He had dug himself into a hole, and now there was no easy way out. He tried to distance himself from Emily, but every time he did, she would threaten to expose their affair. The more desperate she became, the more reckless Richard grew. Lily, unaware of the full extent of the danger she was in, continued her investigation. She found text messages on Richard's phone, saw the way he would sneak out of the house late at night, and even followed him once to a seedy motel on the outskirts of town. Each new piece of evidence she gathered made her blood boil with anger and disgust. She knew she had to tell her mother, but something held her back. Maybe it was the fear of shattering the illusion of their happy family, or maybe it was the gnawing doubt that her mother would believe her. Evelyn was so in love with Richard, so blind to his faults, that Lily wasn't sure how she would react. But Lily wasn't the only one with doubts. Richard's paranoia was growing by the day. He could sense that Lily was getting closer to uncovering his secret, and the thought of losing everything he had worked so hard to build was too much to bear. He began to take drastic measures. He changed his phone password, deleted text messages, and even started carrying a second phone just for Emily. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and Lily was closing in on the truth. The tension in the Johnson household was palpable. Richard and Evelyn still maintained the facade of a happy couple, but beneath the surface, everything was falling apart. Lily continued to dig for evidence, but her investigation had turned into a dangerous game. One evening, while Richard was out working late, Lily finally gathered the courage to confront her mother. She laid out everything she had discovered: the texts, the late-night trips, and the secret phone. Evelyn listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Lily finished, there was a long, uncomfortable silence. Finally, Evelyn spoke, her voice trembling. "You must be mistaken, Lily. Richard loves us. You would never do something like this." Lily couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could her mother be so blind? But as she looked into Evelyn's eyes, she realized that it wasn't blindness, it was denial. Her mother was so desperate to hold on to the life they had that she was willing to ignore the truth, no matter how painful it was. Feeling defeated, Lily retreated to her room, leaving her mother alone with her thoughts. But that night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were growing fast. Meanwhile, Richard was with Emily, trying to convince her that everything was under control. But Emily was done with empty promises. She wanted more commitment, more time, and more proof that he was serious about their future together. In a moment of desperation, Richard promised Emily that he would leave Evelyn. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. He could never leave his wife, his stepdaughter, or the life he had built. But he also knew that he couldn't let Lily continue her investigation. She was getting too close to the truth, and he couldn't afford to let that happen. As Richard drove home that night, a dark thought crossed his mind. A thought that terrified him, but also offered a twisted solution to his problems. If Lily was the only one standing in the way of his secret, she needed to be removed from the equation. The idea of harming Lily repulsed Richard at first. He wasn't a violent man. He had never even raised his voice in anger, let alone hurt someone. But the fear of losing everything he had worked for consumed him. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only solution. Days turned into weeks, and Richard's paranoia grew. Every time Lily looked at him, he felt as though she could see right through him, see the lies and deceit that he had carefully hidden away. It was unbearable. Emily, on the other hand, was growing more demanding. She wanted him to make a decision, her or Evelyn. Richard couldn't take the pressure anymore. He was a man on the edge, and it was only a matter of time before he snapped. One evening, while the family was sitting down to dinner, Richard couldn't help but notice how happy Lily seemed. She was laughing, talking about her day at school, and for a moment Richard was struck by the innocence of it all. But that moment was fleeting. As the night went on, Richard found himself alone in the living room, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do, but he didn't know if he had the strength to do it. He poured himself a drink, hoping it would calm his nerves, but it only made him more agitated. Lily was in her room, typing away on her computer, probably documenting more of her findings. Richard could hear the faint sound of her typing, a constant reminder of the threat she posed. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, grating on his already frayed nerves. He couldn't take it anymore. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest, and walked to the kitchen. The knife block caught his eye, and before he knew it, he had one of the knives in his hand. The weight of it felt foreign and wrong, but at the same time, it felt like a solution. Richard walked up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. His hand shook as he reached for Lily's door. He hesitated, his mind screaming at him to stop, but something darker urged him on. He pushed the door open, and there she was, sitting at her desk, completely unaware of the danger that was just a few feet away. Richard stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. But then Lily turned around and their eyes met. She saw the knife, the fear in his eyes, and in that moment she knew. She knew that the stepfather she once trusted was gone, replaced by a man who was capable of anything. Lily's eyes widened in fear as she realized what was happening. Richard, her stepfather, the man who had raised her since she was a little girl, was standing in her doorway with a knife in his hand. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the fear, the desperation. But there was something else there too. Something cold, something that sent a chill down her spine. She tried to speak, to reason with him, but the words caught in her throat. Richard took a step forward, and then another, until he was standing right in front of her. Lily backed up, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped. For a moment, Richard hesitated. The knife felt heavy in his hand, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. He could see the fear in Lily's eyes, the way she was trembling, and it made him feel sick to his stomach. But the fear of losing everything was stronger. The thought of his affair being exposed, of his life falling apart, was too much to bear. He had come too far to turn back now. With a shaky hand, he raised the knife. Lily gasped, her eyes filling with tears. But Richard didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The knife came down, and with it, the world went dark. Lily's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The room was eerily silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of Richard as he stood there, staring down at what he had done. The reality of it hit him like a freight train, and he staggered back, dropping the knife. He had done the unthinkable. He had taken a life, a young, innocent life, all to protect a secret that now seemed so insignificant. The weight of his actions crushed him, and he felt his knees, tears streaming down his face. But there was no going back. Lily was gone, and nothing he did could change that. The only thing he could do now was try to cover his tracks, to make sure no one ever found out the truth. Richard knew he had to act fast. Panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He had to make it look like an accident, something that would explain away the horror that had just taken place. He grabbed the knife and wiped it clean, trying to erase any trace of his fingerprints. Then he dragged Lily's body to the bathroom, his heart pounding with every step. He couldn't believe what he was doing, but he was in too deep now. There was no turning back. In the bathroom, he filled the bathtub with water and gently placed Lily's body inside. He had read somewhere that drowning could mask other injuries, that it could make it look like an accidental death. He hoped that was true. As the water covered her lifeless form, Richard felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had to keep it together, had to stay focused. But the sight of Lily's body, so still, so cold, was too much. He turned away, fighting the urge to be sick. He cleaned up the blood in Lily's room as best he could, scrubbing the carpet, wiping down surfaces, anything to erase the evidence of what had happened. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get rid of the smell, the metallic scent of blood that seemed to cling to everything. When he was done, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew what he had to do next. He had to call the police, and had to make it look like he had just found Lily, like he had no idea what had happened. With trembling hands, he dialed 911. The operator's voice on the other end was calm, professional, but Richard could barely hear it over the sound of his own heartbeat. "My stepdaughter," he stammered, trying to sound as distraught as possible. She's in the bathtub. I think she's drowned. Please, you have to send someone." The words felt hollow, like a lie that had been rehearsed too many times. But he had no choice. He had to keep up the act, had to make them believe it was an accident. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens piercing the quiet of the night. Richard watched from the front porch as they swarmed the house, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to stay calm, had to keep his story straight. When the officers entered the bathroom, they found Lily's body in the tub, just as Richard had left her. The sight of her pale, lifeless form sent a shiver down their spines. One of the officers, a seasoned detective named Bennett, immediately sensed that something was off. Richard played his part well. He cried, he pleaded, he begged them to tell him what had happened. But Detective Bennett wasn't fooled. She had seen too many cases like this, too many accidental deaths that turned out to be something far more sinister. As the investigation began, Richard found himself under intense scrutiny. Detective Bennett questioned him relentlessly, probing for any inconsistencies in his story. Richard did his best to stay calm, to keep his lies straight, but it was getting harder and harder. Every time he saw Evelyn, his guilt threatened to consume him. She was devastated, her grief overwhelming, and it tore at Richard's already fragile conscience. He couldn't bear to look her in the eye, knowing what he had done. But as the days passed, Richard began to think that maybe, just maybe, he had gotten away with it. The police had no solid evidence, nothing to tie him directly to Lily's death. As long as he kept his cool, he might just escape the consequences of his actions. But Detective Bennett wasn't giving up. She was determined to get to the bottom of what had happened to Lily, and she wasn't going to let Richard off the hook so easily. The pressure was starting to get to Richard. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's lifeless body, felt the weight of the knife in his hand. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything other than the guilt that was slowly eating him alive. Evelyn was no better. She had become a shadow of her former self, barely eating, barely sleeping, just drifting through each day in a haze of grief. Richard tried to comfort her, to be the supportive husband she needed, but it was all an act. Inside, he was falling apart. Meanwhile, Detective Bennett continued to dig. She interviewed everyone who knew the Johnsons, searching for any clue that might point to what really happened. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that Lily's death was no accident. But she had no proof, nothing concrete that she could use to bring Richard in. And without that, all she could do was watch and wait, hoping that he would slip up. And slip up he did. It started with small things. Richard forgetting details of his alibi, stumbling over his words during interviews. But then one night, he made a fatal mistake. In a moment of weakness, he called Emily. He needed to hear her voice, needed to feel some connection to the life he had before everything went wrong. But what he didn't know was that Detective Bennett had tapped his phone, hoping to catch him in a lie. The conversation was short, but it was enough. Bennett had what she needed, a connection between Richard and the affair that had led to Lily's death. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a start. With the new evidence in hand, Detective Bennett redoubled her efforts. She obtained a warrant to search Richard's office, looking for anything that might tie him to the crime. What she found was more than enough to raise suspicion. Hidden in a locked drawer, Bennett discovered a series of emails between Richard and Emily. The emails were explicit, detailing their affair and their growing desperation to keep it hidden. But there was one email in particular that caught her attention. In it, Richard had mentioned Lily. He had written about his fears that she was getting too close to the truth, that she was starting to suspect something. The tone of the email was frantic, panicked, as if he was on the verge of doing something drastic. Bennett knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let Richard slip through her fingers, not when she was so close to bringing him to justice. She confronted Richard with the emails, watching his reaction carefully. He tried to deny everything, to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but it was clear that he was rattled. The cracks in his facade were growing wider, and it was only a matter of time before he broke. Evelyn, who had been in the dark about the affair, was devastated. The revelation of Richard's betrayal was almost too much for her to bear. She couldn't believe that the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her life and her daughter's life, could be capable of such deceit. As the noose tightened around him, Richard became increasingly desperate. He knew that it was only a matter of time before Bennett found something that would seal his fate, and in his desperation, he made another mistake. He went to see Emily, hoping to convince her to keep quiet, to protect him from the fallout. But Emily, who had been pushed to the brink by the constant lies and deceit, was no longer willing to play along. She told Richard that she was done, that she was going to the police to tell them everything. And in that moment, Richard snapped. When Richard realized that he couldn't convince her, his desperation turned to rage. In a moment of blinding anger, he lashed out, grabbing Emily by the shoulders and shaking her. The fear in her eyes only fueled his fury, the reality of losing control pushing him to a point of no return. "I did everything for us," he shouted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You can't just walk away from this." But Emily was resolute. She pushed him back, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm done, Richard. I'm going to the police. It's over." Those words, "it's over," echoed in Richard's mind like a death sentence. He saw his entire life unraveling before his eyes. His career, his reputation, his marriage, everything. In that moment, a cold, terrifying clarity washed over him. Before he knew what he was doing, his hands were around Emily's throat. She struggled, clawing at his arms, her eyes wide with terror. But Richard was beyond reason. All he could think about was silence. Silencing her, silencing the fear, the guilt, the looming end of his life as he knew it. The struggle was brief but brutal. Emily's attempts to fight back grew weaker, her eyes glazing over as her strength ebbed away. Finally, she went limp, her body collapsing into Richard's arms. For a moment, Richard just stood there, panting, staring down at what he had done. The reality of it hit him like a wave, nearly knocking him off his feet. He had killed again, this time in cold blood. Emily's lifeless body lay crumpled at his feet, a stark reminder of the depths to which he had sunk. He was no longer just a man having an affair, no longer just a stepfather trying to protect his secret. He was a murderer, twice over, and there was no escaping that now. Richard's mind raced as he tried to figure out his next move. He couldn't go to the police, he knew that much. But what could he do with Emily's body? How could he cover up this second murder? He quickly realized there was no easy solution. Unlike with Lily, there was no way to stage Emily's death as an accident. The truth was, he had acted on impulse, and now he was paying the price. Desperation took over as he searched the room for something, anything that might help him cover his tracks. He considered calling the police and pretending to find her dead, but he knew Detective Bennett would see right through that. She was already suspicious of him, and this would only confirm her worst fears. Finally, he decided on a plan. It was risky, but he had no other choice. He wrapped Emily's body in a bedsheet and carried it out to his car, praying that no one would see him. His heart pounded in his chest as he drove to a remote spot on the outskirts of town, a place where he hoped no one would find her. Detective Bennett had been relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Something about Lully's death just didn't sit right with her, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. The more she investigated, the more convinced she became that Richard was hiding something big. When she received the call that Emily had gone missing, Bennett's suspicions only deepened. The timing was too convenient, too coincidental. She knew she had to act fast before Richard had a chance to cover his tracks. Bennett began piecing together the evidence, the emails, the phone calls, and the inconsistencies in Richard's story. It all pointed to one thing. Richard was involved in both Lully's death and Emily's disappearance. But she needed proof, solid, irrefutable proof. She obtained another search warrant, this time for Richard's car and his home. As she and her team combed through every inch of his belongings, they found traces of dirt and debris that didn't match anything in the immediate vicinity. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Bennett to follow her hunch. She had the soil samples analyzed and compared with other locations around town. The results led her to the remote spot where Richard had buried Emily. When they unearthed the shallow grave, Bennett's heart sank. She had been right, but it was a hollow victory. Another life had been lost, and she couldn't bring Emily back, but she could bring Richard to justice. Armed with the evidence she needed, Bennett confronted Richard at his office. She laid out everything she had found: the emails, the phone calls, the soil samples, and finally, Emily's body. Richard's face drained of color as he realized that his carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling. There was no way out this time. Bennett had him cornered, and he knew it. For a moment, Richard considered denying everything, playing dumb, trying to warn his way out of the situation. But he could see in Bennett's eyes that it was pointless. She had him, and there was no escaping it. With a heavy sigh, Richard slumped in his chair, defeated. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to protect my family, my life." Bennett's expression hardened. "Your life," she echoed, her voice cold. "You destroyed 2 lives, Richard. 2 innocent people are dead because of your selfishness." Richard had no response. He knew she was right. All the lies, the deceit, the murders, it had all been for nothing. His life was over, and there was no one to blame but himself. Under the weight of Bennett's relentless questioning, Richard finally broke. He confessed to everything. Lully's murder, the affair, and Emily's death. The words spilled out of him in a torrent, a twisted mixture of guilt, shame, and desperation. Bennett listened in silence, her face an unreadable mask. She had heard confessions before, but this one was different. It was raw, unfiltered, and utterly devoid of any attempt to justify or excuse what he had done. When Richard finished, he looked up at Bennett, his eyes hollow. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Bennett didn't answer right away. She just stared at him, her mind processing everything she had just heard. Finally, she stood up and motioned for the officers standing outside to enter. "Now," she said quietly, "you pay for what you've done." The officers handcuffed Richard and led him out of the office. As he was escorted to the police car, he caught a glimpse of Evelyn standing in the crowd that had gathered outside. The look on her face was one of utter devastation, her world shattered by the truth she had been so desperate to avoid. Richard couldn't bear to look at her. He had lost everything: his family, his reputation, his freedom. And now, all that was left was the long, lonely road to prison. The jury had found him guilty on all counts: murder, obstruction of justice, and a host of other charges. As the judge handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Richard felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. The lies, the fear, the guilt, it was all over. He had finally been caught, and now he would pay the price for his sins. Evelyn, who had sat in the courtroom every day of the trial, didn't look at Richard as the verdict was read. She had already mourned the loss of her daughter, and now she mourned the loss of the man she had once loved. But there was no forgiveness in her heart, no room for the man who had destroyed her life. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, he glanced back one last time, hoping for a glimpse of Evelyn, a sign that she might still care. But she was already gone, leaving him to face his fate alone. And so, Richard Johnson, once a respected lawyer, a loving husband, and a trusted stepfather, became just another prisoner, another lost soul in a system designed to punish the guilty. The perfect life he had fought so hard to protect was gone, replaced by a lifetime of regret and remorse. And in the end, that was his true punishment. Not the prison walls, not the bars and the windows, but the knowledge that he had destroyed everything he had ever cared about, and there was no one to blame but himself.